Hello, everybody, and welcome to VRIC Media, the most trusted voice in metals and mining. My name is Jesse Day, and I have the honor today of being joined by Taylor Kenney, economic journalist and host of Taylor Made Economics on ITM Trading. We're going to talk about the push for a cashless society. We're going to be diving into the gold markets, the global economy, and a lot more. Taylor, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Great to be here, as always.
Yes, well, there is no doubt that a lot of countries and policymakers are pushing today to remove cash as a valid means of transacting. You recently attended a baseball game, a bit of undercover journalism there, and the stadium would not accept cash. The last time I was in Amsterdam, it was almost impossible to pay with cash anywhere. Everything was cards only. Should people be worried about this growing trend? And how can people push back against it?
Yeah. Absolutely. This is something I'm really passionate about. I was raised in a pro-cash household, and to see this, more and more businesses going cashless, I don't even think we should call it a trend, to be honest. I think a trend diminishes what's going on. In my opinion, this is much more of a coordinated effort. That's how I feel about this. We know it's happening at the highest levels. The IMF has been talking about going cashless for years now, right? They've been putting out reports about cashless societies and how really cash is a thorn in their side because it prohibits them from having total control, right? They've put out studies on wanting to do negative interest rates. Can't do that as long as there's cash. As long as there is an escape hatch, it's going to be harder and harder for them to control the population. That's really how I feel about it. So it's genius here in the United States because instead of just coming out and banning cash, which would be wildly unpopular, right? They come out and they say we support cash, but then what happens? They're making it more and more difficult for businesses. It's under this guise of convenience. They're removing cash at more and more places. And I think the biggest way to fight back, of course, is to not support those businesses when possible and to use cash and keep it alive, right? The more that we use cash, the more we keep it alive. And then, of course, just spreading awareness, because I think a lot of people don't realize what's going on. If it's just one business here, one business there, it's a little bit easier to not realize that this is happening on such a widespread movement.
Well, walk us through your experience at this baseball game. Where was this stadium? What was it like? Did you try to use cash? And you also mentioned last time I was talking to you, they had like reverse cash ATMs where you traded cash for a card. Could you walk us through just your whole experience there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to a game on my own time and saw they all had these buttons that said like, we are cashless and proud. And I thought, okay, I got to come back here and check this out. So I grabbed my producer, Edgar. We went to Chase Field Stadium, Diamondback Stadium, which I also like to say this is not a slight against the people who work there. You know, everyone's just trying to earn a paycheck. But we go in, and I only brought a $20 bill to see what would happen. And I tried it at a couple stands. They all told me, ever since 2020, no cash for convenience. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. So what do I do if I only have cash? And they said, well, we have these reverse ATMs. They're great. You put in your cash, and it spits out a card, which I had never seen one, heard of one. Since then, I've done a bunch of research, and they are replacing ATMs all across the United States. It's now the big gangbuster business. ATMs are not being made anymore. It's reverse ATMs going in for cashless businesses. So you go up to this machine, which also I couldn't find. No one knew where it was. I finally found one. The line on this thing was crazy. Meanwhile, the concession stands were empty. That was another thing I was told. It was supposed to speed things up, but it was the opposite. Everyone was waiting in line. I put in my $20. It spits out this card that she said, oh, there's no fees, you know, it's good to go. But if you flip it over, it expired in a year. And every month you didn't use it, you lost $3.95 off of it. And on top of that, they said, well, you can use this anywhere, but you had to remember exactly what was left on it. So let's say you had $7 left and 20 cents. If you went to the grocery store, you'd have to say, can you put $7.20 on this? I mean, it's just a scam, in my opinion. And it was shocking to see this on such a wide scale. And they said it was every venue in Arizona has gone this way, all major sporting venues.
That's crazy. You got to bring a pen and notepad with you to write down your balance.
No, it was.
One
it
second.
was
How
nuts.
much was that again? You took off my card and you got to write it down.
And just like gift cards back in the day, right? How many people have these cards sitting around thinking there's still something on them, not even reading the fine print, realizing they're literally stealing from you, right? And isn't cash supposed to be legal tender? I mean, again, for me, I was just shocked. I was shocked by the whole thing.
Yeah, like if fiat currency is the opposite of a store of value, I mean, this is going even further in that it's taking money off of your balance. I want to highlight one regulation out of Spain. This was something that raised a lot of alarm bells regarding limits on cash withdrawals. It has been falsely reported, but still cause for concern. It's called Article 38. It obliges financial institutions, not individuals. This is where the confusion came up online, to include any cash movement above 3,000 euros in their information return. I'm going to read something here from a website called Crypto Slate. It says Spain's reporting overhaul means the tax agency will receive granular, near real-time data on every sizable cash movement and virtually every card transaction. So a lot of people thought this meant bank customers had to file reports with the tax agency or risk this huge fine. It's actually the banks themselves. Nonetheless, tracking by tax authorities, more of that, not a good thing. What are your thoughts?
I mean, obviously, you know what I'm going to say. Anytime there's increased financial surveillance, I'm not a fan of it. And I think that personally, while there was some confusion around this initially, to dismiss this as no big deal just because of that initial confusion is still missing the bigger point, right? Just because it's not you having to report it, that means your bank is now an informant, right? Even more so. And we're talking about 3,000 euros. I mean, we're not talking about 1 million, right? Or 500,000. What happens next? 1,000? What are these arbitrary low amounts that they're putting on you? I mean, 3,000 euros, you can barely go buy a gold ounce, right? If you want to, a gold coin. What do they need to know this for? And I think that's where it's scary for me is 3,000, 1,000 next. And then anytime you withdraw cash, right? That's where we're going. It's surveillance creep, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the law change in Spain is part of a broader clampdown in the EU on cash payments. Italy, France, and Portugal are all enforcing sub 3,000 euro cash limits for commercial payments. And the EU is always pushing for less cash being used in transactions. You were talking about these areas in Arizona that are pushing for this. How do you think, are people largely sleepwalking into this? Did you see other people at the stadium you were at pushing back against this, or was everybody just kind of, okay, fine, I'll go to these reverse ATMs? And what is the danger there of people perhaps sleepwalking into a world where we end up purely with digital cash?
Yeah, I think, well, it's funny. At the stadium, it was half and half. A lot of the people who I saw at the reverse ATM, I think there was maybe a novelty component to it because they had never seen this either. So that was maybe the energy overall. But even it was funny just walking through the stadium, I overheard two ladies there who said, can you believe it that they don't take cash? Well, one, you better believe I U-turned and, started chatting them up. And they said, no, we only ever pay in cash. Like, had we known that, we wouldn't have even come here and supported this business, right? And the outrage online was huge. So I think there are a lot of people who are aware. And then there are a lot of people who just think, oh, it's just new technology, something moving along. And in Europe, too, I mean, it's funny, the ECB, they come out and they say we support cash, right? But something I think is interesting is, I don't know if you saw, they did a study last year around CBDCs, right? And widespread adoption in Europe. And overwhelmingly, people did not want CBDCs. And when you think about a launch like that with a digital euro, right, it's kind of like, how are you going to get widespread adoption if there are alternatives? And I think this goes back to that escape hatch kind of idea that we were talking about earlier, where if people can just use cash, then there's going to be less adoption for maybe a future plan. So it's one thing to come out and say, we support cash, don't look over here at what we're doing, but we're going to make it really hard for everyone to use cash. I think that's the reality of what's going on. And yeah, people are sleepwalking through it for sure. That's a good way of putting it.
You released a video recently on ITM trading titled Physical Gold versus ETFs, Why Your Wealth May Be at Risk. We know the classic gold bug adage, if you don't hold it, you don't own it. But what do you see as the main risks in gold and silver ETFs? And what about the ones that can prove physical ownership, like Sprott's PHYS and PSLV?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, the thing I always come back to is, why are you buying gold? Right? That is for me the baseline question that I always ask everyone, because I've had friends come to me before and say, hey, I see what's going on. I'm concerned about the dollar. I'm concerned about debt. I'm concerned about what's happening. I want to be protected, right? That is a different conversation than someone who comes to me and says, oh, I see gold is up X% this year and I want to trade or make an investment and make a profit. Not to say that you're not going to make a profit off of physical gold too, right? But they're different mindsets. Even if there is allocation, because that is something I talked about a lot, is many of these ETFs, it's a claim on a pool, right? And then you're even one step further from ownership. But even if it's allocation, redemption is another huge concern I have with a lot of these. I don't know exactly what Sprouts, but I think it's significantly high. Like you have to have a lot that most people wouldn't have, right? Institutional level buying in order to redeem for physical gold. So again, you kind of have to be okay with never having physical. You also have to be okay with all of the intermediaries, right? All of this risk. For me, every time there's a layer of custodianship and person, and maybe it's across a foreign border, there are so many things that could go wrong. And that's why, again, for me, physical is the way to go, because you're just eliminating all of that counterparty risk.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. If you're trying to trade and make a profit, you pay a smaller premium. You're more easily able to liquidate your position. It's that there is a bit of a hassle with selling physical gold and silver as well as compared to just clicking a mouse button. So it really does depend on your goals.
Your
Thank you for
mindset,
breaking
your
that
goals.
down.
Yep.
Yeah. So I spoke to both yourself and Mario and Echo on the channel not too long ago. We discussed the concept of a monetary reset involving gold. You mentioned you thought it was already happening. I spoke with Matthew Peipenberg recently. He echoed your sentiments. He said the train is already in motion. We are entering a world where gold is replacing the dollar, but it's just more of a slow movement gradually. It's not that when people hear the word monetary reset, they think the system's collapsed and now out of the ashes, we have to start bartering with gold and silver to rebuild our society or some extreme situation like that. But in reality, that I don't think that's how things work. Could you explain the signs you're seeing and how you think this reset could play out over the long run?
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously will double down on what I said before and agree with Matthew. He's very smart. I love him. So I think as far as the reset already being in motion, what signs we're seeing, yes, it is a process that leads to this kind of event, right? Or a series of events that leads to a big event, however you want to kind of wrap your head around it. What we're seeing right now are a lot of different things happening in tandem. So whether that's BRICS nations working on alternative payment methods and cross-border trade, right? Part of the larger de-dollarization effort of nations ditching the dollar and moving towards gold, which of course is central banks buying record amounts of gold. And then you have here at the United States, all of this geopolitical risk, and you have all of this debt that's continuing to be unsustainable. We've been saying unsustainable forever, but that's because it cannot be sustained forever. And we're reaching a breaking point, right? Where you cannot afford the debt, especially if the buyers aren't there, or even if the buyers are there at what rate, right? There's a lot of different ways, again, to think about this, but there's so many threats right now happening. And in my opinion, I just don't think the train's left the station. I don't think it's turning around anytime soon, right? Even if it goes faster or slower, it is moving on a one direction track.
Yeah, completely agree with you there. And of course, the out of control debt. We have the big, beautiful bill. I believe it's not quite passed yet. There's it was passed in the Senate and then now it's being blocked and we'll see what happens. But, if that gets passed, I think we're going to see a lot of extra debt, a lot of extra spending, and of course, Trump raising the military budget to over $1 trillion for 2026. The list goes on and on at the wasteful spending going on through governments. The experiment of running a fully backed gold currency, though, is actually underway right now in Zimbabwe, of all places. I want to read something from FX Street. Also known as Zimbabwe Gold, the ZiG is a structured currency backed primarily by 2.5 tons of gold, along with other foreign exchange reserves, including $100 million of USD. The government introduced the gold-backed currency in an effort to stabilize the country's financial system in April 2024. Now, adoption not going as hoped, largely because this is the sixth attempt by the Zimbabwean government to rectify their currency. Previous efforts have been not much less than stellar. The Zimbabwean president has stated he wants the ZiG to be the only currency by 2030, and now most people in the country transacting with US dollars. How do you see this experiment playing out?
Yeah, what's the saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me six times.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, here, I think the problem here, the crux of it is redemption problem, right? You can say all day long that your currency is backed by gold, but if it's not redeemable and it's already failed so many times, why on earth would anyone trust you, right? Why would you trust that paper currency? And what's to say, even if you trust today that gold is there and that everything's backed and everything's good to go, what's to say that when things get tough, when the going gets hard, that the country isn't going to print more and going to devalue the currency again, right? Especially when we're already starting from such an unstable position. So I don't blame people for being skeptical. I think, again, the last thing people want to be left with is just another paper promise 2.0. And so I don't know if it's going to be a success. I'm very hesitant to say that adoption is going to work.
Yeah, especially because what they're throwing in, there's also 100 million USD backing it, huh? Well, aren't you trying to discourage people from using USD and use this instead?
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm off base here, but I've looked into this a little bit, and it seems like there's a lot of mystery, and like the reserves themselves are shrouded in secrecy, which is not a new concept to us here in the United States either. But again, coming from a country that already has had so much turmoil, it's difficult to imagine. Again, can you really even trust that those reserves are there?
Yeah, and I would say the answer is no. I mean, the politicians in most parts of the world are corrupt. They're especially corrupt in Zimbabwe. How do you think a gold-backed currency could work in theory in a place like the US, Canada, UK, etc.? Do you think this is something that these governments will even attempt to introduce? I can't imagine they would ever allow actual redemption for gold in that case. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they would back it by a certain amount of gold using blockchain technology, something like that. But they would still need that stake in the game because the debt-based system is what keeps this oligarchy and this kind of political overclass, these overlords, it keeps everybody alive, the donor class. So I just don't see how they would allow something like that unless they were able to somehow manipulate and control it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. It's funny. This is a question I get all the time on ITM. Like in our comments, I see people ask, do you think there will be a gold-backed currency? And I think it's because people ultimately want that in a way. But again, in order to get there, do I think it's going to be with redemption? No, I don't think so. Absolutely not. And I think if we were to even get to that point, it's either going to be just smoke and mirrors and some kind of mirage and illusion, or it's going to be something similar to what we were just talking about that's not going to work anyway. And it would only be born or forced out of a situation where confidence in the dollar collapsed completely, right? We've escalated in this monetary reset and we're at a point where the game is up and they have to pivot and come up with some new rules in the system. And at that point, trust is going to be so broken, it would be difficult to proceed with something that I think would be a success.
Yeah, I spoke to G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, and he was saying actually you should beware if the government ever comes out with a supposed gold-backed currency because they are there to deceive you and they are there to kind of give you hope. And they are certainly going to be scheming and deceiving you behind the curtain as they give you the supposed gold bug's dream, If
it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, especially if it's coming from the political class.
Right.
What are your thoughts on a digital gold token on the blockchain potentially being used for transactions? There are a few companies out there with projects at the moment. Of course, we just talked about you don't hold it, you don't own it. But the advantage, of course, is being able to actually spend gold. Whereas if you have physical gold, your coins are worth at least $3,000, more than that at this point. But even walking around with coins worth $3,000 in your pocket, you can't really, there's no ability to spend a fraction of that. Whereas with the digital version, you can. Do you think there's any merit to a digital gold solution that perhaps this is a way that we can transact with gold in our day-to-day lives?
Potentially. I think, listen, I'm supportive. I don't want to dog on any entity, company, person, institution out there who is trying to come up with a creative or modern solution to a failing fiat system, right? Like ultimately, for me, that's a win, any kind of win. I think, though, ultimately that there are still concerns for me around it. And I, again, believe it comes back to functionality and why you're having it and why you're using it. If you're just using it as another type of currency, then that's perfectly fine. Do I have concerns, though, around its longevity in the sense that it's new, right? In terms of humankind, these are brand new solutions and ideas and technology, really, compared to, again, gold, which has been around, physical gold, for thousands of years. So there's a lot to be seen. Like, I do have concerns around centralization or consolidation. I think, though, that will all play out, and maybe it has its role to play. Maybe it helps bring some kind of sanity and semblance and something that we can use in the meantime. I don't know. So I'm not going to sit here and say anything negative about it. I think that Yeah, there could be merit to that for sure.
Now, we are potentially reaching the end game of a fiat currency experiment that's been around since 1971, a global fiat currency experiment. A lot of people point to the end of that potentially being catastrophic. Are you a
Mm.
prepper in the sense that aside from physical gold and silver, are you stocking food? Do you believe people should stock water? In the United States, obviously, potentially ammunition and weaponry. Do you think that these things are important? Perhaps having another location you can go to, even perhaps diversifying your residence permits and getting a residence permit in another political jurisdiction, another country, so that you could have at least a couple different options. Where is your mindset at when it comes to the potential collapse of this debt-based system, how bad it could get, and how people could prepare for it?
100%. I absolutely am a prepper. I'm a proud prepper. It's funny, I grew up in rural Southern Oregon, so it wasn't even about what's happening with a monetary reset or fiat currency collapse. It was just a way of life. We didn't call it prepping. Then as I went out on my own and moved to a city, I realized I left that part of me behind. And there's so many reasons why we should be prepared. For me, it was really geopolitical risks that kind of started getting me more interested in it in my adult life, which then led me back into sound money, which was also something I was raised with, but I'd kind of strayed from. And it's just been this amazing full circle journey where I am today, I believe everyone absolutely should be prepared. And once you've kind of woken up to this idea, I always tell people just start. Right? Anyone out there who's listening and is wondering like, okay, I have my gold and silver, or I'm prepared in this way, but not that way. It's overwhelming. Just start. Start, yes, with food and water. Start with networking. Get a plan in place, right? I mean, there's no end once you begin. There really isn't an end to being prepared. But I believe, yes, everyone should absolutely be prepared. And that will look different for everyone too, depending on where you live, what your resources are. But there's no reason everyone shouldn't have basic preparedness measures in place.
Yeah, I agree with that. The main move I've taken is diversification of residencies. One thing I would point out to people, I gave a presentation about this at the VRIC, is that once you get a residence permit in a location outside of your home country, you now have two countries you can just walk into, doors open for you, no questions asked. Just show your residence permit at the country that you've gotten a residence permit at, and you just walk into your own country with your passport. So even that small step, that also opens up possibilities of diversifying your bank accounts. So you now have your fiat currency in two different political jurisdictions in case anything happens. So that's something people can think about. Obviously not super easy for everyone to do, but that's the route I took. I want to talk about the Wyoming Gold Act. This is an act introduced earlier this year. It would be a law requiring the Wyoming State Treasury to hold a minimum of $10 million worth of gold. For the moment, the act is being passed on by the governor. He had some concerns about the value of gold potentially going down, although they do allow the Treasury to buy gold when market conditions present a potential opportunity. More and more states are starting to discuss accumulating greater gold reserves. Ohio and Utah both have gold allocations at present. Utah estimated to hold around $60 million in physical precious metals. Do you expect more state action there in the U.S. when it comes to stacking gold? What impact do you think that could have?
Yes, definitely. I think that this is a movement that we are just in the beginning stages of, to be honest. I think that these states, like many individuals or institutions, are sitting there waking up and realizing, okay, what's going to happen next, and are we prepared for it? And the answer is no, right? If everything you have is dollar denominated, it's not going to end well. So I think it's wonderful. It's also becoming more politically positive, right? There's kind of a lot of support for many of these acts and legislation that's moving through that does support bringing gold back to the forefront. And I think that we could see some added steady demand for gold from it. I think if nothing else, it's just bringing more awareness and continuing to bring gold to the forefront. So my hope is that as these states are taking this action, more citizens here in the United States are going to wake up and realize, again, there's a reason these states are doing it. Maybe they're not as tuned into what the central banks are doing the way that we are in our industry. But if they see that there is something happening within their home state, maybe it's going to spark a light bulb moment for many people out there.
And there is an organization out there called the Sound Money Defense League. They have been working to pass legislation in a number of states supportive of gold and silver as money. At the base minimum, they're really helping to remove any tax obligations associated with buying and selling gold and silver, doing great work out there. Well, Taylor, this has been a fantastic conversation. Truly appreciate you coming on the show. Tell us about tailor-made economics on ITM trading.
Yeah, absolutely. So tailor-made economics, what I do is I break down complex financial topics so we can learn and grow together. I try and make everything really easy to understand while bringing you the most current information. On ITM trading, we specialize in gold and silver and lifelong wealth protection. So if anyone out there is curious about how they can protect themselves with physical gold and silver or getting a strategy in place, we are the people to help you out. So I appreciate you having me on. As always, Jesse, such a pleasure.
Great. Well, I'll put a link in the description below to the ITM Trading website, as well as the YouTube channel where people can tune in to your show. Awesome conversation, and can't wait to do it again.
Thank you so much.
In 2011, after a massive earthquake and tsunami occurred in the Fukushima region of Japan, 3 of the Fukushima Daiichi reactors melted down in one of the biggest nuclear accidents since Chernobyl. Now, in the aftermath of this, nobody died directly as a result. However, the world started to shut the nuclear industry down. Japan shut down all of their reactors. Germany and several other countries followed suit, and nuclear energy was deemed a danger and an existential threat to humanity. Prior to this, uranium, the commodity that fuels these reactors, was ripping to all-time highs, a bull market that was unimaginable to most. And in the aftermath of this worldwide shutdown of the nuclear fleet, prices plummeted and uranium was in a sustained long-term bear market, with the industry abandoned and all but forgotten by market participants. Now, everything is starting to change. We are experiencing a complete 180-degree turn when it comes to the uranium industry and nuclear. Countries around the world are embracing nuclear energy, all sides of the political aisle, from environmental activists to capitalists and everywhere in between. This is an opportunity unlike anything else I have seen in the commodities sector, and it's there waiting for you to grasp. So join me as we dive into Uranium Investing 101.